Can you act like the perfect wife just for 1 week? The native woman begged, lonely cowboy. Caleb's life had always been simple. He woke up at dawn every day, with the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon, painting the sky with warm orange and pink hues. His days were filled with the sounds of cattle and the rhythm of his boots hitting the dusty earth. The ranch he owned, nestled in the vast open land, was his home. There was something comforting about the silence that surrounded him. No busy streets, no loud conversations, just the stillness of nature. But that stillness was also what made Caleb feel alone. He had never been the type to make friends easily. His rough lifestyle, spending most of his time tending to animals and repairing fences, didn't leave much room for relationships. He had a few acquaintances in the nearby town, but they were all as busy with their own lives as he was with his. He wasn't unhappy, but there were times when Caleb couldn't help but feel the weight of loneliness. He watched families gather around their dinner tables, couples sharing quiet moments, and children running through fields, and he longed for something more. Yet every time he thought about trying to change his life, his work pulled him back. The cows, the land, the responsibility. It was all consuming. One afternoon, while Caleb was mending a fence near the far side of the property, he heard the sound of horse hooves approaching. It was unusual. He hadn't seen anyone for days, and the closest town was miles away. His first thought was that someone might be in trouble. He put down his tools and made his way to the edge of the ranch where the road met the trail. That's when he saw her, Ayanna. She was riding a horse with a calm, controlled grace, her long black hair flowing in the wind. There was something striking about her, not just in her appearance but in the way she carried herself. She had an air of confidence, but there was something else. A weariness in her eyes that didn't quite match her calm exterior. As she rode closer, Caleb noticed the faded red dress she wore, the dirt on her boots, and the way her horse seemed tired as if it had been on a long journey. When Ayanna dismounted, she walked toward Caleb, her gaze steady but filled with uncertainty. There was an awkward silence between them for a moment, before she spoke. "Are you Caleb?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. He nodded, taken aback by her directness. "I am. Can I help you with something?" Ayanna hesitated, looking around as if searching for the right words. She wasn't from around here. Her accent was unfamiliar, but her manner was polite. She seemed like someone who had come a long way, and Caleb had a feeling her journey wasn't just physical. She seemed tired, and yet there was something resolute in the way she held herself. "I need a favor," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "I know this might sound strange, but I've heard you're a man of your word." Caleb raised an eyebrow, unsure where this conversation was headed. "I try to be," he said simply. Ayanna took a deep breath and continued. "I need you to pretend to be my husband. Just for 1 week." Caleb blinked, the request so unexpected that it took a moment to process.
"What do you mean pretend?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "I need you to act like the perfect husband," she explained.
"I'm not asking for anything too complicated. Just for 1 week, you need to be the man that my family expects me to have. It's for my honor, for my family." Caleb stared at her, still trying to wrap his head around what she was asking. "And why me? Why come all the way out here for something like that?" Ayanna shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Because I don't know anyone else. I've traveled from far away, and I've exhausted all my options. I've heard stories of you, of your integrity, and I thought, maybe you could help." Caleb took a step back, thinking it over. His life had always been solitary, and the idea of getting involved in something like this felt strange. Why would she choose him, a cowboy who barely left his ranch, to play the part of a husband? But as he watched her, Something in her eyes made him reconsider. There was a vulnerability to her, something raw that seemed to call out for help. Maybe she was desperate, or maybe she was just a woman caught between two worlds, her own life and the life her family expected her to live. After a long pause, Caleb spoke again. "What's the catch? What's this really about?" Ayana's face softened. "It's complicated. My family expects me to be the perfect wife, and I can't meet their expectations on my own. They want me to marry a man they've chosen for me, but I can't. I need to prove that I'm capable of fulfilling my duty. If I can show them that I'm a good wife, then maybe they'll stop pushing me to marry someone I don't love." Caleb listened carefully, sensing the weight of her words. He didn't know much about her life, but it was clear that she was caught in a difficult situation, one that went beyond simple tradition or family pressure. "All right," Caleb said after a long moment, his voice low and steady. "I'll help you, but this won't be easy. I'm not used to pretending to be someone I'm not." Ayana looked at him with a mix of gratitude and relief. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I promise I won't ask for more than what's necessary." They agreed on the terms of their arrangement. Caleb would play the part of the perfect husband for 1 week, following Ayana's instructions. In return, she would help him with the ranch chores, something he hadn't asked for but she insisted on. They didn't know each other well, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. That night, as they sat down to a simple meal in Caleb's small, modest home, the silence was more comfortable than before. Caleb watched Ayana as she carefully ate, her movements graceful and deliberate. He wondered what kind of life she had lived before coming here, and why she was so willing to endure this for her family's sake. As they talked about little things, her journey here, his life on the ranch, the connection between them slowly began to deepen. It wasn't love, not yet, but there was a sense of camaraderie, a quiet respect. They were two people who didn't belong to each other, yet here they were, bound by an agreement neither of them fully understood. Caleb couldn't help but think that this week, this strange arrangement, might just change both their lives. How could it not? In the space of a single week, they would pretend to be a married couple. But as he looked at Ayana, he realized that pretending might not be as simple as it sounded. There was something in her that stirred him, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb found himself wondering what it would be like to not be alone. The following days passed with an unexpected rhythm. Caleb wasn't sure what he had expected from the arrangement, but it wasn't this. It felt like living in someone else's shoes, doing things he never thought he'd do. Each morning, Ayana would instruct him on how to act, reminding him of the roles they were playing. But something about it all started to feel strangely natural. Their mornings began early, with the sound of the rooster crowing as dawn broke. Caleb would prepare the fire, and Ayana, with a gentle grace that Caleb found both calming and impressive, would prepare a simple breakfast. At first he was unsure how to help her in this role, but Ayana, with a smile, showed him how to set the table and pour the coffee. While their routine was simple, there was something refreshing about it. The work was mundane, but it was comforting to see Ayana in action. She moved around the house as though she belonged there, quietly humming to herself as she washed the dishes or cleaned the room. Caleb couldn't help but notice how different she seemed from the women he had met in town. There was no pretension about her, no artifice. She was kind, but also strong. Her presence in the house felt like a quiet storm, a peaceful power he hadn't realized he needed. As the days went on, Caleb found himself looking forward to these moments. Even though they were based on a false pretense, the arrangement was starting to feel less like acting and more like a real partnership. They didn't talk about it often, but sometimes Caleb would catch Ayana's eye across the room, and they would share a brief, unspoken understanding. Their connection was growing, but neither of them acknowledged it outright. The hardest part of this arrangement was playing the part of the perfect husband, not because Caleb didn't know how to be kind or respectful. He had always tried to be, but because he was trying to act in a way that seemed so foreign to him. He was used to solitude, to not having to be accountable to anyone. Now, he found himself trying to be present in a way that felt new and unfamiliar. He helped Ayanna with the housework, did the things she asked of him, but sometimes it felt like he was forcing himself to behave in a way that wasn't truly him. One evening, after a long day of work, Caleb found himself sitting outside, staring at the sky. The stars above were as clear and bright as ever, and he wondered how Ayanna was really feeling. She had been quieter the past few days, and though she carried on with the charade, Caleb could sense something weighing on her. She never mentioned it, but he knew there was something more to her than the woman who pretended to be a wife for the sake of her family's honor. After a while, Ayanna joined him outside. She sat beside him without saying anything at first, simply looking up at the stars. Caleb glanced at her, noticing the way her eyes softened as she stared into the vastness of the night sky. "Ayanna," Caleb said gently, "do you ever think about what you're doing here?" She didn't answer immediately, but Caleb wasn't looking for a quick response. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think about it all the time," she admitted. "I came here because I had no choice. My family, they expect so much from me. They want me to be perfect, to be the woman they think I should be. But I'm not sure I can do that. I don't know if I can be the perfect wife they want me to be." She paused, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "I thought maybe if I could show them that I could pretend, at least for a while, they'd leave me alone. But the more I pretend, the harder it gets." Caleb listened, not knowing what to say. He could see how much it hurt her to be caught in this web of expectation and tradition. She was a woman caught between two worlds, one where she was expected to be obedient and perfect, and another where she longed for the freedom to live her life on her own terms. "You don't have to pretend," Caleb said quietly, almost without thinking. He turned to face her, his voice soft. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, not to me, and not to your family. You just need to be yourself." Ayanna turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "But what if who I am isn't enough?" she asked, a note of sadness in her voice. "What if my family won't accept me unless I follow their rules? What if they never see me for who I truly am?" Caleb didn't have an answer for her. He couldn't offer her any promises, but he knew that what she was going through was painful. He could see it in the way her shoulders slumped when she thought no one was looking, in the way she hesitated before answering questions that required her to reveal too much of herself. The silence between them lingered for a moment before Caleb spoke again. "You're enough, Ayanna," he said softly. "Maybe not in their eyes, but you are to me." Ayanna smiled faintly, though it was clear she didn't fully believe him. Still, something about his words seemed to comfort her, even if only for a moment. She gave him a small nod before turning her gaze back to the stars. For a long while neither of them spoke, content to sit in the quiet company of one another. Caleb, for his part, couldn't help but feel a sense of peace with Ayanna beside him. The stars above seemed to shine just a little brighter, as if the universe itself was offering some form of reassurance. The next day, Ayanna seemed to have shaken off some of the sadness that had clouded her eyes. She was still quiet, but there was a renewed determination in her step. They went about their work on the ranch, the routine becoming more natural with each passing day. But Caleb noticed the change. He noticed how Ayanna seemed more at ease with herself, even though she was still playing a role. It was as if the small moments of vulnerability they had shared had unlocked something in her, something that allowed her to breathe a little easier. By the end of the week, their partnership had grown deeper than either of them had expected. The charade of a perfect husband and wife was no longer just an act. It had become something more meaningful. Caleb was beginning to understand Ayanna in ways he hadn't anticipated. The strong, determined woman who had asked him to play a role was also a woman who longed for something more. She longed for acceptance, for love, and for a place where she could be herself without fear of judgment. But Caleb knew that the week was almost over, and the end of their agreement would soon be upon them. What would happen then? Would they go their separate ways, as if nothing had ever changed, or would this brief moment in time be the beginning of something more? Only time would tell, but Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, things had already changed, both for him and for Ayanna. As the week continued, Caleb and Ayanna's days fell into a routine that felt both comfortable and strange. What had started as a simple agreement between two strangers had gradually transformed into something deeper, something more complicated than either of them had expected. The roles they were playing as husband and wife began to blur, and while they still kept up appearances, there were moments where their connection felt undeniably real. Ayanna's quiet demeanor had changed over the past few days. She wasn't as withdrawn as she had been when she first arrived. There was a softness to her now, a tenderness that Caleb hadn't seen before. She smiled more often, especially when Caleb made an effort to do something small, like taking extra care to make the bed or making sure she had enough firewood for the evening. These small gestures were simple, but they seemed to matter more to Ayanna than Caleb could have guessed. Still, Ayanna remained distant in her own way. There were times when she would retreat into herself, as if the weight of her family's expectations was still heavy on her shoulders. Caleb noticed these moments, but he didn't push her. He understood that some burdens were not his to carry. Yet, as each day passed, Caleb felt an unfamiliar tug in his chest, a concern for Ayanna's well-being that went beyond the role he was playing. He began to wonder what her life had been like before she arrived at the ranch, what had driven her to seek out his help, and what she was truly running from. One evening, after a long day of working together on the ranch, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Caleb had always found peace in these quiet moments, but tonight there was a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. Ayanna had been quiet all day, too quiet for Caleb's liking. She hadn't laughed or even smiled much, and he noticed that her usual spark seemed dimmed. He couldn't ignore it anymore. "Ayanna," Caleb began, his voice soft as he glanced over at her. "Is everything all right?" She turned to him slowly, her face a mixture of surprise and caution.
Why wouldn't it be? I don't know,
Caleb replied. "You've been different today."
It's like something's on your mind. Ayanna lowered her gaze to her hands, twisting the hem of her sleeve.
"It's nothing," she said quietly. "Just thinking about things. It's hard to keep pretending, Caleb. Every day I wake up, and I feel like I'm living someone else's life. I don't know how much longer I can do this. I don't know if I even want to anymore." Caleb's heart sank at the vulnerability in her voice. He hadn't realized how much this week had taken out of her. She had been pretending, living up to an ideal that was foreign to her, and the weight of it was starting to wear on her. "I never wanted you to feel like that," Caleb said, his voice earnest. "I thought maybe this week would help. I thought if I could play the part, if I could be what your family wanted, it would make things easier for you." Ayanna smiled weakly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know you meant well," she said softly, "but sometimes pretending is harder than just being yourself. I thought I could keep up the act, but with each passing day, It feels more like a lie. And I'm afraid that when it's all over, when we go back to our separate lives, it will all just be gone. Like it never happened. Caleb didn't know what to say. He understood what she meant. They had been living in this bubble for days, pretending to be something they weren't, and he had never once stopped to think about how it might affect Ayanna. He had been so focused on making sure she felt like she could live up to her family's expectations that he hadn't considered the toll it would take on her heart. "Ayanna," Caleb said, his voice gentler now. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to pretend for me. Not anymore. If you need to be yourself, I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to decide if he was being sincere. Caleb held her gaze, not wanting to look away. He wasn't pretending anymore. He wasn't acting the part of a husband for the sake of an agreement. He had grown fond of her in a way that was honest and real. He wanted her to know that she didn't have to carry the weight alone. Ayanna didn't speak for a long time, and Caleb wondered if she even knew how to respond. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Caleb," she admitted. "I don't know what my family will do if I don't meet their expectations. They've made it clear that I have no choice but to be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter. If I can't prove that I'm worthy, they'll never accept me." Caleb's heart ached for her. He could see the fear in her eyes, and it was the kind of fear that ran deep, that stayed with you long after the moment had passed. He didn't know what it was like to be trapped by family expectations, but he could feel the weight of her struggle in the way she spoke, in the way she held herself. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," Caleb said quietly. "Not to me, and not to your family. You're already enough. And if they can't see that, then that's on them, not you." Ayanna's lips parted, and for a moment it looked like she might say something more. But then she simply nodded, her gaze drifting back to the setting sun. She didn't say anything else that evening, but Caleb could tell that something had shifted within her. The weight in her eyes seemed a little lighter, and her shoulders were less tense. Ayanna seemed to take Caleb's words to heart. She was still quiet at times, but she began to let go of the tension that had gripped her. She stopped trying so hard to pretend, and instead, she started living in the present. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Caleb, too, began to let go of his own role. He didn't need to act like a perfect husband anymore. He just needed to be himself, and that was enough for Ayanna. The more they worked together, side by side, the more they understood each other. They were no longer just two people playing a part. They were partners, sharing something deeper than a temporary arrangement. But despite the small changes in their relationship, there was still a nagging feeling in the back of Caleb's mind. The week was coming to an end, and with it, their agreement. What would happen when this was all over? Would they simply go their separate ways as if nothing had changed? Or was there something more between them, something worth fighting for? For now, all Caleb could do was be there for Ayanna, to support her in whatever way he could. And in his heart he knew that whatever came next, it would be a new beginning for both of them. The days had passed quickly, and Caleb couldn't ignore the feeling that something was shifting between him and Ayanna. The week they had agreed on was nearly over, and though their connection had grown stronger, there was still an underlying tension in the air, one neither of them dared to address. It was as if they were walking a fine line between friendship and something more, but neither knew how to cross it. Their days were still filled with the same routines, working the land, tending to the animals, and sharing quiet moments together. But now there was a sense of comfort between them. Caleb had come to value these quiet times more than anything. Ayanna, too, seemed more at ease. though she still carried the weight of her family's expectations on her shoulders. She no longer spoke as much about her obligations, but Caleb could see the worry in her eyes. She was torn between the life she had been raised to live and the life she was discovering with him, here on the ranch. As the week neared its end, Caleb found himself increasingly anxious. He wasn't sure what would happen once the pretense of their agreement was over. Would they just part ways, as strangers who had played a role in each other's lives? Or had the time they spent together changed things in a way neither of them could ignore? He couldn't shake the feeling that their bond had grown deeper than a simple arrangement, but he didn't know how to voice it. What would Ayanna think of him when the week was over? Would she feel the same way? One afternoon, Ayanna came to him as he was finishing up some repairs on the barn. She had a look on her face that was both hesitant and determined, something Caleb had learned to recognize. She needed to talk. "I've been thinking a lot about this week," Ayanna said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity. She stood a little apart from him, as if unsure whether to come closer. Caleb put down his tools and wiped his hands on his pants, giving her his full attention. "I know the week is almost over," she continued, "and I've been trying to figure out what comes next. What happens when the pretending is over?" Caleb's heart raced a little, and he felt an overwhelming need to say the right thing. He had spent so many days trying to be the right man for her in the context of their arrangement. But now the question was looming. Could he be the right man for her in a real sense?
I don't know, Caleb said honestly, his voice low.
"I didn't expect this to become more than what it was, but I care about you, Ayanna. I care about you in a way I never expected to." Ayanna didn't speak for a long moment. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, and Caleb could see the conflict inside her. She wanted to believe him, but she was still holding on to something: the ties to her family, the expectations that had been placed on her for so long. "I didn't expect to care about you either," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But something about this week has made me realize just how much I've been pretending, not just for my family, but for myself. I've been hiding from what I really want." Caleb's chest tightened as he listened to her words. The walls she had built around herself were starting to crumble, and it was a powerful thing to witness. "I've been pretending too," Caleb admitted. "Not because I wanted to be someone else, but because I thought it was the only way to help you. But I don't want to pretend anymore, Ayanna. I want to be real with you." Ayanna finally stepped closer, her gaze softening as she met his eyes. For a long time they just stood there, the weight of their shared silence hanging in the air. "I don't know if I can just let go of everything my family expects from me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I can't keep pretending to be something I'm not either. I don't want to live my life in a way that makes me feel like I'm losing who I really am." Caleb reached out, gently taking her hand in his. He felt her tense for a moment, but then she relaxed, her fingers closing around his. "You don't have to be anyone other than who you are," Caleb said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You're already enough, just as you are." Ayanna looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of insincerity. But what she found was nothing but truth. There was no act in his words, no pretending. It was as if, in that moment, they had both laid their cards on the table, stripped away the masks they had worn for the sake of their roles. What remained was simply them, Caleb and Ayanna. "I don't know what the future holds," Ayanna said after a moment, "but I don't want to let go of this. I don't want to lose what we've started, no matter what happens with my family or with anything else." Caleb's heart swelled at her words, and he felt a surge of hope rise within him. He had never imagined that a simple arrangement, a fleeting moment in time, could lead to something so real. But as he stood there with Ayanna, the decision felt clear. He didn't want to let her go either. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that, for the first time in a long time, he wanted to find out with her by his side. "I don't want to lose this either," Caleb said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know what the next step is, but I know I want to take it with you." Ayanna smiled then, a soft, genuine smile that made Caleb's heart race. For the first time in days, the tension that had lingered between them seemed to disappear. They were no longer pretending, no longer living in a world of roles and expectations. They were simply two people, standing together, facing the uncertainty of what lay ahead. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch, Caleb and Ayanna stood side by side, the weight of the past few days falling away. They didn't need to have all the answers. They didn't need to know what the future held. What mattered was that, for the first time, they were living in the present. And in that moment, it was enough. The final days of the week were drawing to a close, and Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming to an end. The pretense of their arrangement had nearly run its course. The roles they had been playing as husband and wife were slipping away, and soon they would be left with the reality of what they had built together. But Caleb didn't want to think about it. He didn't want to face the inevitable separation that seemed to loom on the horizon. Ayanna had changed over the course of the week. She had come to the ranch a woman burdened by expectations and obligations, caught between the traditions of her family and her own desires. Now, she was someone different, stronger, more certain of herself. She no longer seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. There was a lightness to her that Caleb found himself drawn to, a quiet confidence that had emerged from the vulnerability she had shown him. But the question remained, what would happen once the week was over? Would they go back to their separate lives, as if nothing had changed? Or was there something more between them, something worth holding on to? As the last day of their arrangement arrived, Caleb found himself struggling with his own emotions. He had spent so many days focused on helping Ayanna fulfill her family's expectations that he hadn't truly considered his own feelings. But now, as the moment to say goodbye approached, he realized just how much he cared for her. Ayanna seemed to sense the same unease. She had become quieter in the past day or two, her eyes distant, as if lost in her own thoughts. Caleb watched her carefully, wondering if she was thinking the same things he was, wondering what would happen when the week was over. On their final evening together, Caleb invited Ayanna to sit with him outside, just as they had on the previous evenings. The stars were beginning to appear in the sky, and the air had cooled with the onset of dusk. There was something peaceful about the stillness of the night, but it felt different now. The silence between them felt heavier than before, as if both of them were waiting for the other to speak. Ayanna sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Caleb waited, his heart beating a little faster than usual. Finally, it was Ayanna who spoke first. "I don't know what to do now," she said softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I've been thinking about this week, and I can't help but wonder, what happens next? After everything we've shared, do we just go back to our separate lives? Is that really all this was?" Caleb felt a pang in his chest at her words. He had been wondering the same thing, but hearing her say it aloud made it feel more real. He didn't want it to end, didn't want to go back to the solitude he had lived in before. He had come to care for her in a way he hadn't expected, and he wasn't ready to let her go. "I don't want it to end," Caleb said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He turned to look at her, his gaze intense. "I don't want to go back to being alone, Ayanna. I don't want to pretend anymore. What we've shared, it's real, and I don't want to lose it." Ayana turned to him then, her eyes searching his face. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, as if weighing the words that had just been spoken. Finally, Ayana spoke, her voice softer than before. "I don't want to lose it either," she admitted, "but I'm scared. I've spent so much of my life doing what others expect of me, trying to live up to their standards. I've never let myself be who I truly am, and now, with you, I feel like I'm finally starting to understand who I could be. But I don't know how to move forward. I don't know if I can just let go of my family's expectations, of everything they've taught me." Caleb reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You don't have to do it alone," he said, his voice soft but full of conviction. "I'm here, Ayana. Whatever happens, I'll be by your side. You don't have to carry this burden on your own anymore." Ayana's eyes filled with emotion as she looked at him. She had been holding on to so much for so long: her family's expectations, her fear of disappointing them, her uncertainty about her own worth. But in that moment, with Caleb by her side, she felt like she was finally able to let go of the weight that had been holding her down. She had found something real, something worth fighting for, and for the first time she felt like she was allowed to choose her own path. "I've never known what it's like to truly be free," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But with you, I feel like I could be. I could be myself without all the pressure. I could be happy." Caleb smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of hope and tenderness. "You deserve to be happy, Ayana. You deserve to live the life you want without anyone else telling you what to do or who to be. And I'll be here every step of the way." Ayana looked down at their hands, her fingers gently tightening around his. She wasn't sure where this journey would take them, but for the first time she felt a sense of clarity. Caleb had given her something she hadn't realized she needed, someone who saw her for who she truly was and accepted her without judgment. "Maybe we don't have all the answers," Ayana said, her voice steady now, "but I know one thing. I don't want to let go of this. I don't want to let go of you." Caleb's smile widened and he squeezed her hand. "Then we won't. We'll take it one step at a time, together." The night stretched on, the stars shining brightly above them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Caleb felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that with Ayana by his side, he was ready to face whatever came their way. The next morning, as the sun rose over the ranch, Caleb and Ayana woke to a new beginning. The week that had started as a simple arrangement had turned into something much deeper, a bond between two people who had found something real in each other. They didn't know what the future would bring, but they knew they were no longer pretending. They were finally living their truth, and that, in itself, was enough. The days that followed felt like a turning point, not just for Ayana, but for Caleb as well. The week that had started as a simple arrangement, a way for Ayana to fulfill her family's expectations, had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated. They were no longer acting or pretending to be something they weren't. They had shared something real, something that went beyond the roles they had been playing. Ayana no longer looked at Caleb with uncertainty. The weight of her family's demands had loosened a little, and with each passing day she seemed more at peace with herself. There was a new lightness to her, a warmth that Caleb couldn't ignore. They had both spent so much of their lives trying to live up to others' expectations, but now they were starting to carve out a space where they didn't have to pretend. They could simply be who they were. The final day of the week arrived, and Caleb could feel the tension in the air. He had been trying not to think about the inevitable end of their agreement, but now that it was here, it seemed impossible to ignore. He had grown so accustomed to Ayana's presence that the thought of her leaving left him unsettled. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he wasn't ready to let go of what they had. Ayana, too, seemed quieter than usual. She had spent the past few days reflecting, perhaps wondering about the same thing. What happened when the pretense was gone? Would their connection survive once the week had ended? That afternoon, after a long day of work, Ayana approached Caleb as he was finishing up with the horses. She stood off to the side, watching him with a mixture of hesitation and determination in her eyes. Caleb wiped his brow and looked up at her, sensing that something important was about to be said. "Ayana?" he called out, his voice gentle but filled with curiosity. "Is everything okay?" She hesitated for a moment before walking over to him. There was a seriousness in her step, as if the time had come to address everything that had been left unsaid. "Caleb," she began, her voice steady but with an edge of uncertainty, "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about this week, about us, and I think I need to ask you something." Caleb straightened up, his heart beating a little faster. He had no idea what she was about to say, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was important. "What's on your mind?" Ayana took a deep breath, clearly gathering her thoughts before speaking. "I came here looking for something," she said, her voice soft yet unwavering. "I was looking for a way to prove to my family that I could be the perfect wife, but what I didn't expect was to find something else, something real." Caleb felt a knot form in his stomach. Was she about to tell him that this had all been a mistake? That she was going to return to her family's expectations and leave everything behind? "I don't know what I thought this week would be," Ayana continued, her eyes meeting his, "but what I've learned is that I don't want to go back to the way things were. I don't want to be that woman anymore. The one who hides behind family expectations and never allows herself to live for herself. I don't want to lose what we've found here, Caleb." Relief washed over him like a wave. He had been afraid that the end of the week would mean the end of something real. But Ayana wasn't walking away. She was choosing something different. She was choosing herself and choosing him in the process. "Ayana," Caleb said softly, stepping closer to her. "I don't want you to feel like you have to pretend anymore. Not for me. Not for anyone. You deserve to be free, to live your life the way you want, not the way others expect you to." Ayana looked up at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "But what about you? What happens when this week is over? Will you just go back to your life and forget about all of this?" Caleb shook his head, his voice steady. "I don't want to forget about this. I don't want to forget about you. This week, this time we've shared, it's meant something to me, Ayana. I care about you more than I thought I would. I want to be here for you, no matter what comes next." Tears welled up in Ayana's eyes, and she blinked them away quickly, as if unwilling to show too much emotion. But Caleb saw the rawness in her gaze, the vulnerability she had let go of after so many years of hiding behind the expectations of others. She was finally allowing herself to be real, to live without the fear of judgment. And Caleb couldn't help but feel honored to be part of that journey. "I don't know what the future holds," Ayana said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "But I know that I want to take the next steps with you, Caleb. I want to be with you, not because I'm pretending, but because I've learned that I can be myself with you. And that's enough." A wave of warmth spread through Caleb's chest as he looked at her. For the first time, he felt a sense of certainty, a feeling that he wasn't just living day to day in solitude. He had found something worth holding on to, and he wasn't going to let go. "I want that too." Caleb said, his voice full of sincerity. I want to be with you, Ayanna. Whatever comes next, I'm in this with you.
We'll figure it out together. Ayanna smiled, her face lighting up with a mixture of relief and joy.
The tension that had been building between them for the past few days seemed to melt away, replaced by a shared understanding. They were no longer two strangers caught in a false pretense. They were two people standing together, choosing to face the unknown together. As the sun set behind them, casting the ranch in a golden glow, Caleb and Ayanna stood side by side, knowing that they had crossed a threshold. Whatever their future held, it was now theirs to shape, and they would do it together. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and that was enough for now. The week that had begun as an act had turned into something far more meaningful. They had found each other not in the roles they were playing, but in the truth they had shared. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt at peace, knowing that he wasn't alone anymore. The road ahead was uncertain, but with Ayanna by his side, Caleb was ready to face whatever came next. Together they would write their own story, one without pretense, one filled with honesty and love.